Thank you for inviting me. I want to do something today I usually don't do, which is to start the discussion autobiographically, because it's relevant to the subject. I was born in 1938, and in 1950, right, I would have been 12. And as we're watching the Olympics, there are all these Olympians saying, you know, I started skiing when I was 3 or 4. Well, I need to tell you that I became a political junkie when I was 5 or 6. So by the time we get to the 1950s, and I should say I was in junior high and high school, in 1956, I went to college. I was fully engaged and interested, not only what had happened in the past decades, but what was happening all around me. And I was allowed, my parents allowed me to stay home to listen and watch every bit of the House Un-American activities, hearings. In fact, I became a truant, and the truant officers came to our house. And my parents says, it's okay, she's sick or something. So I actually watched all the hearings, and I was totally engaged in the politics of the time. Let me turn a page. My mother was in the theater business, and she enrolled my younger sister, me, in every imaginable dance and drama classes. Hoping that we would become performers. She succeeded with my sister, but she clearly didn't succeed with me. And the drama school I was sent to was called the Dramatic Workshop. And the Dramatic Workshop was run by somebody named Irving Piscator, Piscator. There's a biography of him and quite a few books, because he was arguably the most important director in Germany and German-speaking parts of Europe in the interwar period. And he was the director for almost all of Brecht's plays. And when Hitler came to power, it was very obvious that he and Brecht would be in trouble, and they immediately took off and came to the United States. And both of them spent the entire war in the United States. And when McCarthy started holding his hearings, he hauled both of them in to give names of other people in the theater and literary world who were suspicious characters, communists, and whatever. Bertolt Brecht, for those of you interested in drama, the very day he was called, the next day he got an airline ticket, he went back to Europe, and Piscator ran this dramatic workshop, and he left a few days later. He left his wife behind. I never met him, but I was a student in his school. The school in those days, almost all the important actors you've ever heard of in the 1950s, 60s, 70s were students, because the dramatic workshop preceded the actors workshop, where everybody you've ever heard of who was a serious actor in the United States studied. At the dramatic workshop, there were the likes of Marlon Brando and Paul Newman. I remember play reading whenever they needed children or young adults with Marlon Brando and all the rest of it. And everybody was concerned and hyped up about McCarthy, McCarthyism, and what was going to happen to their colleagues. Now, why was it that in New York City in the 1950s, the McCarthy period hit so hard? Well, because New York City had a very large chunk of refugees from Europe, refugees from Hitler. In fact, many of them started what became known as the New School in New York City. Hannah Arendt, for example, a theorist, and people like that. And they were running away, obviously, from Hitler and fascism, Mussolini, and so on. So why were these people all tagged as communists? Well, part of the explanation, of course, is that not communism, but Marxism was something that appealed to people in the 1920s, 30s. They read Karl Marx, and to lefties in the political spectrum who were interested in making life better for people and more equitable economically, Marx spoke to them in various ways. Now, many of these people were never pro-Soviet people or pro-Stalin people, although it needs to be said that Piscator once went to the Soviet Union before World War II in order to make a film, which he then never made. But in any event, most of them were not pro-Soviet, not particularly interested in Russia, had learned that the Soviet experiment off of the backs of Marxism was something very different. It was a dictatorship. It had very little to do with what Marx wrote about and so forth. But under the guise of hunting communists, right? All of these people who had ever attended a meeting in the 1930s or somewhere where Marxist ideas were discussed, all of a sudden were called communists in the United States. And what communism really meant and what really was going on in the Soviet Union, generally speaking, people were quite ignorant of. Just the way nowadays people are quite ignorant and are believing the lies that, you know, all the elections were bogus and all the sort of Trump business. In the 1950s, to some extent late 40s, 1950s, we had the equivalent of the media folks that you have nowadays. For example, the person who closely resembled Tucker Carlson on Fox News was a man named Walter Winchell. And everybody who was a right-wing pro-McCarthy person listened to Walter Winchell, and he had the sort of same sort of skewed ideas that you somehow hear from the right in the United States. There were people on the other side trying to mediate that. For example, the equivalent in the 1950s to Rachel Meadows was a man named Barry Gray, who had a late night radio program in New York where he interviewed all kinds of people, but among other things, tried to interview people who were anti the sort of McCarthy thing. So the atmosphere in the 1950s in Hollywood in particular and in New York particular, but also in the rest of the country, was, you know, steeped in this sort of, the communists are coming, they're under every bed, they're going to ruin democracy and all the rest of it. And people bought it. And of course, one of the questions of why people bought it, there's a lot of it in the novel that you're reading, is that, I mean, never mind why people bought it, the kind of people that bought it are not all that dissimilar to the kind of people who are buying sort of Trumpism nowadays. Generally speaking, people who are lower middle class, generally speaking, people who are white, generally speaking, people who feel somewhat alienated. They're not as rich as the rich or as powerful as, you know, the well-educated people. They're economically much more uncertain. And you want to blame your hard luck on somebody. And the somebody for the McCarthy period were communists that would arrive any day, and communists who were already inside the country who would make things worse. And nowadays, of course, it's, you know, the lack of attention that is being given by the mainstream for people who are Trumpites and who belong to the Proud Boys and so forth, who are feeling America is going down the drain. Nowadays, America is going down the drain because we have all these immigrants. The society is changing. People of various colors are living everywhere. Where these people come from, half the time they don't even speak English when they arrive. People forget that their ancestors didn't speak English either, but never mind all of that. So in some echo way, the kind of support that McCarthy had while it was a very different historical period, isn't all that different the kind of support that the right and the sort of fringe groups have nowadays. You have to blame somebody. You can blame the people of a particular religion, of a particular race, if they weren't born in the United States, and so forth and so on. Let me backtrack one more time. I went to college in 1956, and the year before, I went to small liberal arts college in the East, Dickinson College, sort of like Occidental. The year before, apparently one of the faculty took the Fifth Amendment when he was hauled in front of the committee. And he was immediately fired by the president of the college. And then several of the faculty, 4 or 5 faculty apparently, sought to support him. So when I got there, the faculty that had been supporting him, they hadn't even been accused of being communist or anything, and had not taken the Fifth Amendment, were also at risk of being fired. So my very first sort of political activity in college had to do with protecting these faculty who had supported the person who took the Fifth Amendment from getting fired. So even in 56, 57, even though it was really in many ways the end of McCarthyism, this sort of thing still was afoot. Now, the question, of course, is it's interesting history, and I've given you some, probably boring personal comments about it, but what do people think nowadays? Let's move to nowadays, when they are, in a sense, supporting people who are authoritarians of one kind or another. Well, they're against socialism, right? We don't want socialism. The only problem with it is that people are calling things socialist, they're calling things fascist, they're calling things communist, without any particular kind of sense of what these things meant. And I suppose one of the things I could do is to define these terms for you. The trouble is that none of these terms still mean anything even in real life. That is to say, communist Russia and communist Cuba are hardly communist by any definition, right? They're capitalist societies. People are not getting, let me, just for the hell of it, let me give you a definition from the dictionary of what communism meant. A political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating class warfare and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid accordingly to their ability and needs. That's hardly a description of Russia today, is it? Which is basically run by oligarchs of one kind or another, a bunch of rich people who are, getting millions and billions and buying yachts and houses and whatnot all over Europe. And the poor people of Russia are no better off as a consequence. Same thing in the case of Cuba. Cuba is hardly a communist country. It's an authoritarian country, but it's hardly, its economy is now mixed, both government and non-government and so on. So all of the terms that we sort of learn in school and saying, well, but fascism meant something, right? Mussolini and Hitler were fascists. Of course they were. But nowadays, all kinds of authoritarians are also acting like fascists, right? They're autocrats. Are they quite as harmful as Hitler? No, but they're autocrats. They behave as autocratically in some, then saying, well, but fascism had a sort of religious component to it, the belief in a particular, Nazism and all the rest of it. Well, if you go look at the sort of semi-authoritarian and fascist aspects of Modi, who heads the Indian government right now, there's a religious element. The religious element is anti-Muslims, and Muslims are getting killed, and they're very fearful of their lives, and their lives are being made miserable, even though they make up millions of people in India. So I guess what I want to say is, yes, we can talk a lot about what socialism means, fascism means, capitalism means, most societies are now mixed economically, so there's capitalism and whatever. Most societies have socialist elements in the sense that governments do some things collectively on behalf of people. You can get, you can have a real nice, pleasant democracy in Scandinavia, and yes, it's socialist, but socialist, the way it's used in political parlance is as if it's, some really bad thing. We don't want a socialist government because we certainly don't want early childcare, right? That's socialism. Right. On the other hand, we have Social Security and people have gotten used to it. And we have, some government health care and all the rest of it. But we are not as socialist as real socialist countries. Well, what's a real socialist country, right? In Sweden, you have capitalism and people pay taxes. And then the government is empowered in a very democratic way by the population to do certain things. Healthcare, education, early childhood, and all the rest of it. So the words socialism, capitalism, even fascism have become completely messed up and murky. And I will argue with you, if you want me to, that yes, I can give you definitions out of political science what each of these means. But if you look at an actual government anywhere in the world, irrespective of whether it calls itself socialist or communist or democratic or whatever, it's a very mixed bag right now. Is this a bad thing? No, it's not a bad thing. What are the bad aspects of it? If people are unhappy with the particular economic and social system that they have, then they're very likely and very easily victims of blaming other people and trying to diminish the democratic process because they believe that somebody who is more authoritarian is actually able to change their lives because democracy is messy. And so what we have right now is no pure political systems, no pure economic systems. And what we have is all societies, the most stable European societies, are all in a mode right now in which there are a range of political views that are not what we used to have, let's say, 20, 30 years ago, of where you have, Democrats and Republicans, let's say in the United States, and the extremes of the Democrats, you could make a circle linked with the extremes of the Republican, right? You had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, they overlap and at the other end and as well. No, now people are fractured. And how do we know that they're fractured? They're fractured in democratic societies that almost all democracies are now multi-party. They have populists who are on the right and populists who are on the left. You can look at France, you can look at Germany, you can look at Holland, you can Netherlands, you can look at any of these countries. And so the governments, in a sense, are a combination of 2 or 3 political views, which often don't fit together, right? In countries like the United States, where you have a 2-party system, what you have right now is people certainly in the Republican Party right now, who are, we can discuss it later, who are on the fringes of right-wing populism. And you certainly have people on the Democratic side who on the fringes are left-wing populists. And what populists, generally speaking, do is feel very self-righteous, are willing, under certain circumstances, to support authoritarians, and have a kind of a rosy view that if only somebody came in charge that could just ignore laws, rules, domestic laws, international laws, and so forth, things could be made better. Now, I think underlying all of the current authoritarianism everywhere, and of course, China, and we can discuss that as well, is, I think, a incapacity of most of us, and I think it probably includes most of us listening tonight, to deal with the complexity of modern society. Whether you live in Santa Cruz or you live in Shanghai or you live in New Delhi or Paris, there is so much happening right now with technology, with unfamiliar aspects, with some people who seem to master the forefront of technology, making billions. What is it? The 8 richest people in the world have the assets of 40% of the rest of the world. That's shocking. That is really shocking, right? So people either are anxious to change, anxious that the change is in fact impacting them in adverse fashions, and looking for people who have answers and fixes and don't like murky, difficult, lack of clarity in their political systems. So let me then link McCarthyism back to the here and now. And during the McCarthy period, in the Cold War period, people were very fearful, right? Because of the Second World War and the changes that it brought, and felt unmoored. Then we went through a period of settling down. We are now, I now mean the United States, are back in a period of unsettlement. And as soon as people feel unsettled, they're looking for people who have answers. And when people are looking for people who have answers, whether it's in China or whether it's in England or whether it's in the United States, it is very easy for demagogues and authoritarians, A, to take over, and B, to be hunting for people whose ideas don't coincide with theirs. And then you have violence as a consequence, right? I mean, January 6th is in part people willing to engage in violence to bring down what would have been a democratic process, but which they're no longer accepting. This sort of thing is happening all over the world. So in some senses, we always think of the United States as being unique, and that we came, out of the Second World War victorious. And now we don't seem to be the most powerful country in the world anymore, especially if you in the nuclear realm, military realm, perhaps, but not in terms of influence. And that makes us all very shaky. And it means that somebody who has answers, like the Fox News channel, is a lot more satisfactory. And people who listen to the Fox News channel, as I said, were the same people who listen to Walter Winchell. And I assure you, you can find recordings of Walter Winchell. He sounded a lot like Fox. I will stop and entertain your questions and comments.
All right, Professor, we had one from Jim. Would you compare the McCarthy era to the era of the Palmer raids of the early 20s? Did they have the same origins?
I wouldn't use the word origin. Very often they have the same kind of support. If by origin you mean unsettled people, whether it's unsettled about African Americans getting rights, or unsettled about women getting the vote, or unsettled about anything imaginable, they're always overlapping sort of reasons why people go to, whether it's McCarthy or whether it's the various religious figures in the 40s and 50s who got on there. People are looking for answers. And in that sense, anybody who has answers, who seems certain, and furthermore, who knows who to blame, right? McCarthy blamed communists, like they were, under every rug of ours. There were hardly any around, right? Other people blamed religious people or people of a different political party. So the commonality is insecurity, wishing to get answers, and wanting to blame somebody. Silence.
We have a question from Julie. What were the impacts of McCarthyism on people outside of the world of entertainment and the arts?
There were a lot of followers. You know, you could go to Wisconsin, let's say, and the same sort of people who are, you know, trying to change the electoral system in Wisconsin and overthrow the electoral outcome were supporters of McCarthy. And he got wide support. He went after first and foremost identifiable people, but his supporters and the media people who flamed his messages were essentially, once again, the same sort of people. You sat out in Wisconsin, you were afraid of the Cold War. Stalin obviously was doing bad things in Russia. Who was a communist didn't really matter to you. Somebody could have just gone to one meeting in the 1930s somewhere where there were Marxists speaking, and then, oh my God, they're communists, we got to get rid of them. So he had quite, you know, relatively widespread support. The polling in those days was not as good as it is nowadays. I mean, we know, for example, that 71% of the Republicans support Trump at the moment, right? We don't know exactly what percentage of everybody in every state supported McCarthy, but he had a wide support. And there were, as I said, there was the Walter Winchell's was carried nationally, as there was a Hollywood lady. I can't think of her name at the moment. She was an entertainment person, but she spewed the same things. So there were radio was, you know, still the dominant influence. There were people all over the radio. And for those of you old enough, you might remember Edward R. Murrow, who got on television and tried to counter some of this by getting interviews and so forth of people who were saying, well, you know, there is another side to it, you know, so-and-so wasn't really a communist. They once went to a meeting and got swept under the rug with, you know, with all of this. So it was fairly widespread support, I would say, but it was mainly through the radio.
Another question, this time from Patty. Do you have ideas about how we can change the great divisiveness that exists in the US?
Well, no. I mean, if I had real ideas, I could, you know, change the world. No, I think that leadership matters. We have had relatively weak leadership in a lot of places in the United States. And part of the problem today is almost the reverse of what it was during the McCarthy period and early in the century, in the sense that in those days, there were a few voices that everybody listened to. Now there are millions of voices on the internet, right? And so if you are disposed to thinking that, you know, the last election was a sham and the vice president should have overthrown the election results, then you can find any number of people 24 hours around the clock on the internet. So the problem, I think, is that there's an information overkill right now, and it means the people whose ideas are not democratic, not socialist in any way, not fair-minded, often racist, are dominating much of the media that people listen to. And don't forget, most people in the United States, even with all the media, are very ill-informed about politics, especially national politics and international politics. You could walk downtown and ask 100 people where the Ukraine is located, and they probably can't exactly tell you, because we are sort of a subcontinent, right? And even with this sort of large potential access to information, I mean, we can listen to the BBC and to every media of every country. Most people are in fact dominated by two things: the internet, which I already mentioned. And the other thing is apparently, and here there is some information, that something like 80% of Americans get all their information from their local news programs. They don't even get it from their national news programs, NBC, CBS, for local programs. And the local programs are largely owned by outfits which are quite right-wing. Right? Because there are a few sort of media companies, right, who run all the local. So for example, even here in Santa Cruz, look at how many stations you can find on your TV, if you're a Comcast or something, that Fox owns, for example. Right? And therefore the local news might not sound exactly like Fox, but has a kind of, the commentators and so forth are certified by Fox, and there's several other companies, Sinclair and so forth. The information that people have is very limited. What I mean to say is the sources of information that people have is very limited. So it is very, very difficult to get new information and new sensibilities. The other thing is that our education system is so bad. That is to say, elementary, high school, through high school education is in many parts of the country very, very poor. It does not really, have any kind of outreach so people can understand not just the United States, but what democracy would look like, and why it is that, poverty may not necessarily be the fault of poor people. It might be the result of policies, and on we can go. So I don't see any quick fixes. I think it would have to be evolutionary. I think you would have to have improvements in the media. I think that the big companies that are, strewing out false information and are not monitored, they're of course now getting into some difficulties, but in any event, some things need to happen there. Newspapers have largely unread and have gone away. So those kinds of things. Even if we are fans of our local Sentinel, right? We have Mr. Tyson, what's his name? Thiessen, I guess, who is an extreme right-wing individual, right? He writes his op-ed page piece. Are there real counters to what he's writing? Maybe yes and maybe no. But if you're inclined to think that Trump is going to save us, then you're going to read his column, and you're not going to read the column of other people. So I have no solution, but I do think we could use more leaders speaking up, both locally and states and nationally. And here's the rub, of course, that when people speak up, they nowadays get attacked, right? And so now we have a kind of an authoritarian umbrella, which means that if you step up, we're back to McCarthy and to Soviet communism and so forth. You speak up, you give a different opinion, and your life might be at risk. Am I exaggerating? Well, to some extent, but you probably know, especially those of you who might be Rachel Meadows fans, that in Georgia, some of these citizens who manned and staffed the election stuff have been hounded out of their houses and have demonstrated. The governor of Michigan was under threat of kidnapping and so on. So how far do you want to stick your neck out under those circumstances? And so unless people really start addressing some of that at the national and local level, and we all have to speak up, I can't perceive of a quick fix. I think if things are going to get better, I think it's a thing of a decade or so. It might not get better.
Our next question comes from Trisha. Thanks for your presentation this evening. Do you think that the book accurately described the fear that individuals felt over being named as un-American?
Give me the beginning of that question again.
Oh, she thanked you for your presentation.
Yeah, no, the beginning of the substantive part.
Do you think that the book accurately described the fear that individuals felt over being named as un-American?
Yes, yes. I think the book is it's a novel, and it has all kinds of things in it that individuals may not have experienced. But yes, there is the fear. There is the fear of I can tell you that even in high school, I went to Forest Hills High School, that there were individuals who spoke up on certain issues in classes, like history classes and so on. And they were, the parents in some cases were contacted and said that, you probably should tell your son and daughter not to say these kinds of things. This might not be good for you, and so on. So it went all the way down to teenagers and neighbors. We lived in Queens, and there were, lots of people who were anti-McCarthy, but there were lots of people who weren't willing to speak out because there were some McCarthy supporters, and they were afraid, and they were fearful. Some people, not most of them, but some people, like this director Irving Piscata that I mentioned, who is, those kind of people were really famous. They were sufficiently famous to look out after themselves, but even they very quickly decided to get on airplanes and leave because they were afraid of what would happen to themselves in their careers. So yes, lots of people were afraid, and I think the book is quite good on that.
Our next question comes from Jody. We really aren't just a two-party system. Independents are 34% of voters. Democrats are 33%. Republicans 29%. Are the independents growing, and how is it changing the political dynamics?
Well, it may change the political dynamic, but I don't think it has as yet. We shall see, because at the end of the day, even though people align themselves differently in saying I'm an independent, or I'm this, or I'm that, and at the end of the day, we are still predominantly a two-party system, right? And as long as the American two-party system, each party contained a whole range of people, most of the people could fit, at least at election time, somewhere under the umbrella of one rather than the other. I'm exaggerating, it wasn't 100%. But now that you have people in their own corners, and you have the Republican Party and their leader McCarthy, who God knows is a Californian, essentially unwilling to speak up almost on anything, and are just afraid of not getting reelected and wanting to not rock the boat. You have the people who are outside the party trying to speak up, but they're not going to be able to exercise electoral leverage in many of the elections, because the parties, both in terms of money and in terms of their establishment, will get themselves elected, right? So if you were an independent, let's say let's take Wisconsin again, there isn't much hope for you at the moment, right? And also because people are turned off by some of the stuff in the existing parties, they are saying, well, I'm actually an independent. But when you go to the poll, if the choice is, your Democratic candidate for governor versus your Republican candidate for governor, chances are you're going to vote for one or the other, because otherwise you're throwing your vote away. And you know that, right? Some people stubbornly still vote in knowing they're throwing their votes away. So what people say in polls might lead, you're raising a good question in the sense of what people say in polls might in fact lead to more realignment within the party structure. But so far it hasn't really done that, I think.
Our next question comes from Luis. Can you compare what the backlash to McCarthyism and what might be seen as a backlash today?
By today, does the questioner mean Trump? Backlash to Trump?
Possibly. It's not any clearer.
Okay. Well, the backlash was slow in coming because just as the backlash to Trump was fairly slow in coming, and McCarthy, wasn't Trump. McCarthy was not as charismatic speaker. He didn't have the audiences and the TV and so forth exposure that Trump has. And so, and then of course, McCarthy died of, what was it, liver disease or whatever. But he was a lesser figure than Trump. And in some senses, a less prominent figure. McCarthyism was very prominent, but McCarthy himself was to some extent less prominent than Trump is in terms of exercising power over the Republican Party. You probably read that the Republican Party met and chastised Liz Cheney and it's disloyal and so on. He didn't have, there was a more traditional Republican Party at the time, and there was a more traditional Democratic Party, but it should be said that during the McCarthy period, much of the Democratic Party was a racist Southern party against, any inclusion or any civil rights for people who were African American. So that was a phase that was very different than today's Democratic Party. So both parties were really different and played a different role. And I think the comparison, sort of on an emotional level, the comparison between McCarthyism and Trump sort of seems okay, and much in the novel makes you sort of feel, well, that's sort of a little similar than today. But I would say that in the 21st century, things are really quite different than they were at the time, and that the comparison of the danger of authoritarianism and right-wing and prejudice against some groups and encouraging them to do other people in their careers and their livelihoods, there's a lot of similarity to that. But the power and the control of a Trump as an authoritarian, potentially authoritarian leader is really quite different than McCarthy at the time. McCarthy was sort of a cancer. And Trump is not just a cancer. Trump is a potentially, whatever term you want to use, authoritarian, fascist, whatever potential leader. McCarthy wasn't, I would argue.
John asks, is there an antidote to the right-wing media noise today? OANN, Newsmax, Breitbart in particular. And do you think they are propped up by Russian actors?
Well, they probably have some Russian support. But, if you want to hear what the Russians have to say, you can find RT, which is the Russian English language TV station. We have access to it, mostly. I think Russia and China both are trying to impact and affect policy in the United States. I think to some extent that that's true. But I think that if both of them went away, I still think we would have the kind of mess we have on our hands. So while it might be in the margin a contributing factor, and when others who wish us ill, as in Putin and presumably the Chinese leadership, because in the case of Russia, it's a declining country. In the case of China, it's the rising country. I think that if they disappeared, we would still have a problem, a serious problem. is what I would think. And I think, therefore, not sort of looking over our shoulder and blaming the Russians and the Chinese is probably a healthier way to go. And assuming that this is, this is the house we have to fix ourselves. And to some extent, it's our own doing, and our own doing politically. But I also would say our undoing, in a sense, the reason you have the rise of populism in France and other countries is that people in other societies are feeling the same unmooredness because of technology and modern life and all the rest of it. So it is a time when right-wing populists in particular can pick up support, because so many people feel insecure, and an authoritarian populist right-wing leader makes people feel secure because they have answers. So I wouldn't look at others, but I would look at it as a phenomenon of the contemporary world, which is more out of control in some countries than others.
Our next question from another John. Did the threat of nuclear war help McCarthy's cause?
Yes, I think it did. I mean, those were the days when people not only thought there was a communist under every bed, but any day there might be a nuclear conflict. For those of you old enough to have gone to school in the early 50s, you will know that there would be these calls where you had to jump under your desk in school to protect yourself from nuclear weapons, as if that would have helped. But in any event, we all went through these drills. And we had, I remember in maybe junior high still, having dog tags in case there was a Russian attack so people could find us and identify us. Yes, there was a lot of that. There was a lot of paranoia about the Cold War and whether or not we were at risk during the Cold War. There's now a lot of paranoia rising in terms of China, which is unfortunate because China is imagining itself to become the leading power in the world, which it will become. If it's not already, it's close to already. And, conquering little countries doesn't seem to be their priority. Their interest is to have access to the raw materials that they need for their economies, which is why they're investing everywhere, and also having access to markets, right? So I don't think, the Chinese are about to march into California. But there was this fear that not only would we have a nuclear war, but the Russians might, arrive at our doorstep. And even though what I'm about just said is sort of an exaggeration, but that's why we looked at communists, you see, because the communists were aligned with the Russians. And even if the Russians didn't show up at our doorstep, these communists would make links with the Russians, and then they would be inside our gardens, right? That was sort of the logic. By the way, there is one link between McCarthyism and Trump, which is interesting, which is Mr. Cohen. Cohen was this lawyer who was a McCarthyite and who was a prominent figure in the hearings. And he, after McCarthy ceased being a figure, and also after McCarthy died, Cohen became a New York lawyer, a right-wing New York lawyer, and he befriended and Trump befriended each other. And Trump has romantic views of McCarthyism, or at least under Cohen's role in the McCarthy period. So there was this human link between Roy Cohen, and they're good plays, by the way, about that Roy Cohen and McCarthyism. But anyway, so there was this human link that went right straight from McCarthy period to Trump.
Our next question comes from Betty. Does the House Committee on Un-American Activities still exist? And if not, when did it disband?
I don't know the answer to that. It's sort of phased out, but I can't give you the date. I absolutely do not know the answer to that. Probably by the, mid-60s or something like that, but I'm not sure. Earlier, somebody's shaking their head. It still existed later on. The lady who shook her head, no. Yes, I said, do you know when? Could you hold up? 70 something.
well into the 70s.
Well into the 70s.
And
But
it was very active during the civil rights period in the 60s. The House Committee was one of the groups that was used to try to break the civil rights movement.
Yes, but you're absolutely right. And I actually knew that, but it didn't call itself anymore sort of in public, the House on Un-American Activities. You know, it may have had the same title, but it didn't. It was investigating these other things. And so in my mind, for example, there was lack of continuity as to what they were focusing on. By the way, there was a National Student Association in the 1960s, which many students like myself who were interested in the world and interested in anti-McCarthyism and all the rest of it. And it turned out that to the great surprise of some of the leadership, I think it was again in the 70s, but I'm bad on dates, that it was actually funded in part by the CIA. So, you know, we've been doing spooky things like this all along. And yes, there's infiltration, as you probably know right now, of all the various movements in the United States for Black rights and Black Lives Matter and so forth. They're all infiltrated on the one hand by people from the FBI and the CIA, but they're also infiltrated by, you know, populists of one kind or another, and vice versa. You know, the Proud Boys and all of these people are infiltrated by moles from the FBI and the CIA, right? And they report on them, which is why they know who they are. So that this kind of stuff is going on from the right and the left and the center and the government, you know, all the time. But my dates are bad on all of this.
We had somebody comment that the HUAC was disbanded in 1975.
Yeah.
But we've got just about 2 more questions. One from Ames. Norman Thomas, the socialist leader, was very critical of Joseph McCarthy, but he was also very critical of the Communist Party. Can you say more about tensions between socialists and communists in New York City and elsewhere in the 1950s? Why was the relationship between the Communist Party and Socialist Party so bitter in the 1950s?
Right, because the socialists had in mind that you would have more or less democratic institutions. And the socialists were interested in, you know, the distribution of the economic well-being and services for people bettering their lives. And that's why they were interested in reading Marx and were going to all these meetings in which the potential of Marxism was discussed. When Marxism in Russia under Stalin and so on morphed into authoritarian dictatorship, then many socialists who were democratically inclined, but were looking for an economic system that was fairer, felt very hostile and alienated. What had happened to their dreams, right? Because socialism, in a sense, coming out of the reading of Marx, or at least parts of Marx, was a dream of the betterment of all people. Right. And then what you saw were pogroms and millions of people winding up in jail, and no political opposition was allowed and so forth. You had real sort of a fascist on top, layered on top of what was supposed to be a socialist system. And I think the folks like Norman Thomas really deserve a lot of credit for having stepped out there and saying, this is not what we had in mind with socialism. What we're looking at is an awful Soviet Union who is, you know, doing harm to its own people and to other people in the world. And it's a political - economic system, which we don't believe in. And that's what they wrote about. And some of them, of course, were accused of being communists. So they also were hauled in front of the committees and who they knew. Because you see, one of the arguments was, if you were a socialist and you went to some meetings where there were socialist or socialist ideas discussed, you must, even if you yourself claim that you were not a communist, many of those people must have been communists, and those are the people we're looking for. That's what McCarthy's idea was, right? So a lot of these people were asked to name names in order to find the communists, even though they themselves said, we're not communists at all, we were socialists, we're social democrats, and you know, all the rest. I mean, Norman Thomas and these people believed in universal health care, for example, right? And people who were on the right when that was being discussed, and who, you know, thoroughly objected to FDR. I mean, FDR, after all, was accused of all kinds of things. And that he wasn't, you know, he was in bed with communists and this and that because of the various programs that he proposed, which were considered socialist, which is why, if you go back a half an hour, I really said that socialism has become a kind of a curse word, right? Along with fascism and you know, communism, and they're all getting mixed up. If you don't like something, you call people one of those things, you know, really. And then capitalism was the only good thing. So anything you did, which it all echoed the government acting on behalf of their fellow citizens, like providing social security, or providing roads, or providing, you know, services of any kind. Well, that's a bad thing, because that's not capitalist. Capitalists, we just look out for ourselves, right? We don't, and you see this now with the vaccination, right? In any sane kind of way, you would say, well, the government should be responsible for trying to put down this virus, right? But I don't want to be told what to do, you know? Even though the same children were vaccinated for smallpox and everything else imaginable for years, and most people didn't say anything. But this sort of idea that the government is the bad actor, and that government can't possibly be a good actor, making the life of society better, safeguarding climate and all the rest, that is an anathema to those people. It was an anathema in the 50s, and it's an anathema today. And in that sense, there is a line and a trajectory.
Okay.
There was one more, right?
Yeah. Jim asks, do you see Trump's election as in part a racially motivated reaction to Obama's presidency?
In part, yes, because what Obama represented was what is scaring so many people, namely the other are taking over. And, you know, we came to the US in 1860 and we worked hard and we're struggling. And now these other people, they're not like us at all, they're taking over. And the sense that for many people on that side of the political spectrum, Obama presented a danger, not in the person himself, but what he represented. These people of color, these people of whatnot, they're now taking over the country. And that scared a lot of people. And in that sense, the concern about the changing portrait of America has scared a lot of people. And Obama represented that to some extent. And Trump capitalized on it and still is.
If you have just a bit more time, we have one last question.
I have time.
From Jan. There seems to be a definite link between Trumpists and the religious right. Was there any such religious link in the McCarthy era?
Well, can I start with the first bit, which is that while the religious right certainly supported Trump, in more recent times and currently, there's a big split in the evangelical movement. And it started not around a political issue per se, but around climate change. And so while the religious right may be anti-abortion and all of that, there is a big, and it's interesting to hear about it and to read about it, there's beginning to be a real split in the evangelical movement. Among other things, that many of the evangelical churches are now also populated by people from Latin America and other parts of the world, and have gotten used to the fact that their constituents are interracial and have different backgrounds and all the rest. So we shouldn't rigidify the religious right, because just as we're speaking, they seem to be loosening up a bit. Now, going back to the McCarthy period, there was a fairly strong pro-McCarthy segment of the Catholic Church in the United States. There were, in the sort of what we now consider to be, Southern Baptists and so forth, less so, because they were mainly concerned even in the 50s with racial issues rather than the sort of communism and all the rest. So I'm not saying that there weren't linkages. When I lived in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is where I went to college, there were, I think the population was like 22,000 or something, and there were 18 churches. And the population was about 30% Black. There was a rug factory there where many people in World War II moved in to work at the rug factory. And of the 18 churches, there were about 3 or 4 which had manifested pro-McCarthy leanings, and the rest hadn't. Now, that's not scientific, that's just sort of experiential. So yes, there was religious support, but not, sort of massive of any particular group. There was, as I said, there was a strong pro-McCarthy Catholic component at various points.
All right, that seems to be all the questions we have. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor.
My pleasure.
This was a wonderful program, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
And if anybody has any questions, I'm on email and wants to ask further questions, happy to entertain them. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.